Closed mindset. Nothing you can say will change my mind. Hey, that's the way of the world these days, right? We all live in thought bubbles where we seek out information that confirms what we already think, right? That's the state of our culture. But in a technical organization, you cannot let that run amok. You have to keep that under control. You have to try and do away with it, actually. Because this stuff is so complex that you can never anticipate all the nuances of what your system is going to do. No matter how smart you are, this has nothing to do with how smart we are. In order to be successful, this comes right out of the history. We have to be open to real-world information that conflicts with what we already believe, right? And so that is not something that feels comfortable to do, right? It takes us, it's another one of these things that takes us out of our comfort zone. We have to be open to information that conflicts with what we already believe, or we're asking for failure. Now, that was particularly true with the Apollo fire, because everybody thought that they had pure oxygen under control. I'll talk more about that in a second. With the shuttle accidents, it was the field joints on the SRBs, the O-rings, and the foam shedding. And, you know, everybody was convincing themselves that they had these problems under control, right? Closed mindset is an ingredient of that, but I also want to talk about this one, which is false perception of risk. And this is another behavior that is really ingrained in us as human beings. You have a problem or you have a behavior that is not the way you expected, but it doesn't cause a catastrophic failure or a mission failure, and so you keep flying. And the little voice in your head, I'm here to tell you, we have to pay attention to what the little voice in our heads says. If the little voice in your head says it hasn't bitten us yet, so we must be okay, report to the nearest authorities for talking more about that in a more open manner. No, seriously, that is an alarm bell. That should be an alarm bell. If you hear that voice, it hasn't bitten us yet, so we must be okay. This is, if I had to pick one element that is a common thread of all of NASA's human spaceflight accidents, this is the one. And keep in mind, we're talking about behaviors that kind of cross-couple here, right? So if you're under the pressure of cost, schedule, political pressure, if you're in that reality distortion field, you're much more likely to engage in false perception of risk, right? They start talking about O-rings and you say, I don't have time to stop and fix O-rings. I don't have the budget to stop and fix the SRB. We've got to keep flying. We've got to hit 24 flights a year by 1988. Well, you saw what happened. With Apollo, they talked themselves into believing that because they had used pure oxygen at high pressure on the pad in Mercury and Gemini, that they would be okay with it in Apollo. But they didn't perceive the difference between Mercury and Apollo. Mercury had only 1 cubic meter of habitable volume. Apollo, the command module, had 6 times that. So that's 6 times the amount of oxygen, pure oxygen at high pressure, 6 times the amount of non-metallic materials that could be fuel for a fire. And we have, for the very first time, a spacecraft that's big enough to move around in. Not true of Mercury and Gemini. So even though they were trying to prevent the fire by saying spacecraft must be fireproof, so on, so on, so on, there was a break in that chain of prevention when you got down to the factory floor, because you had technicians clambering around in that vehicle, and even though they were trying to be careful, you could end up with damaged wiring which carried power. That's your ignition source right there. You had coolant pipes that were being used as handholds, which caused leakage of a water glycol coolant in which the residue was flammable. And so you've got to be on guard for false perception of risk, no matter what you do. Number 5, groupthink. This is a really common one. It's so common that it's become a figure of speech. And you can be sitting in a conference room and you may be completely on board with what I said before about accountability, where you're the only one who sees a problem, and so you're basically the program in that moment. You better raise your hand. But maybe you feel intimidated, okay? Maybe you haven't been here that long, or maybe there's some other factor that makes you hesitant to raise your hand in the meeting when you see the problem that nobody else seems to be addressing. And so the little voice in your head says, well, they're all smart people, they agree, so they must know what they're doing. That's another warning sign, okay? A key element of success culture is that we must empower people to raise their hand, present that dissenting viewpoint without fear of retribution.